Today on Rebuilders, we are looking at that big ticket item at the US election.
Yeah. A lot of commentary out there and many takes, but we'll be looking really at a macro view. You know, what's the big story here? Perhaps what's some of the commentary missing? What does this mean for our world? What does this mean for our culture? What's the story that this election is telling in which way the world's going?
Great episode. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both today?
I'm good because the streets of our town are much safer.
Are they?
A superhero has emerged. Daniel, after trying to block criminals from stealing
with a shopping
alcohol,
basket.
With a shopping basket.
Yes.
He now has a uniform. He's wearing his underpants over his suit, and criminals are hiding, and there is a hero has emerged.
Yeah. It's got a bed sheet as a cape.
Yep.
Good on you, Daniel.
Yeah, superhero. If you don't know what we're talking about, you need to go back to last week and listen to our banter at the beginning. But we did have an update this week over our continuing commentary on animals in our lives.
Yes. So if you've been listening for a number of episodes, you will know that there's been speculation that a fox has been living under one of the buildings here at our office at Red Church. And we now have established that it's not a fox living under there, though there has been a fox loitering about. It is a possum with another possum, like a little baby possum on its back.
Not little.
Yeah. It's like
No, it's not. It's
adolescent
actually,
possum.
Yeah. It's
So
true.
for those who don't know, in
Free-loading.
other parts of the world, our possums, they're a bit nicer looking than
And they're nice.
the North American
Cute,
possum's
cute.
quite terrifying
looking
or just not attractive. But ours are so attractive. They're the most beautiful possums I've ever seen. But no, so their babies go on their backs, which I
Yes.
think American possums do.
Yeah, I think that's
But like this is like a teenager. This is like a teenager who should have moved out of home
Years ago.
2 years ago, still on its mum's back, going through this little hole under the building.
Yes.
Here's my theory.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. We should back up. So we got more video footage of both a fox digging around this
Yes.
particular part of the building, and then a possum going in and out, and then later on the teenager on its back.
the teenage possum on its back.
So we've got more video footage and evidence.
Yes.
I think, and being from the country,
Okay, thank you.
I think it's a fox. The fox lives under there.
Yes.
But the possum, which we know has tried to inhabit the building previously, has been snooping around, found the hole, and has wanted to move in.
It's squatting.
It's squatting the fox's territory.
Yeah.
And the fox is
Really?
now.
That's what you think.
That's what I reckon. Yeah.
I don't.
What do you think?
I think the possums have made their home under there, and then the fox is like, yummy, yummy, I'm going to eat possum for dinner, and is going to go and get the possum for dinner.
I'm not from the country, so I'm going to defer because you guys know more than me. But I have to concur with Liddy. I think the fox is trying to kill the possums.
Yeah. I think the fox wants possum pie for dinner.
My basis is from seeing foxholes. And that's more of a foxhole than a possum hole.
The thing is, where I grew up, we have more possums down here in Melbourne than where I grew up, and I didn't really
So
see
I'm the
many
expert.
foxes. Yeah, you are. Yeah.
There was a lot of foxholes at D-Day, wasn't there, Daniel?
Don't tell me.
Wow,
But I think this could be a bit of an old Mother Hubbard situation where you find what gets a fox.
is that old Mother Hubbard, or is it the
The lady who ate her.
the lady who swallowed a fly?
Swallowed a fly.
Isn't that old Mother Hubbard?
No, different nursery rhyme.
Different. Oh, okay. All right.
Well, we're gonna.
That's for my side podcast.
Great.
Nursery rhymes.
Nursery rhymes with
The
Liddy.
history of nursery rhymes.
Well,
That would
we'll find
actually be
something to eat a
fascinating.
fox anyway.
What would eat a fox?
A saber-toothed tiger.
They are readily available too.
Well, they're trying to in Australia. So we did have an extinct animal called the Tasmanian tiger,
Or
which
the
also
thylacine.
which also
Oh.
did exist in our state
Is this
as well.
Chris Hemsworth's?
Yeah, I think Chris Hemsworth
side
is
project.
funding it, but they're trying to resurrect it from its DNA,
Yeah.
which does raise a lot of ethical issues of like, do you just bring back dinosaurs then?
I mean, we've explored this before. Jurassic Park has covered this territory. It's not a good idea.
No, I agree. Let's sleeping dogs lie and let the dead thylacine lie.
Well, we'll
good.
continue to monitor the situation underneath the building here at Red Church and keep you posted. But I mean, the unfolding soap opera that is the
It's amazing.
under building narrative is just it's
Zoo.
yeah, it's wild. Well, on today's episode, we are looking at a significant event that has taken place. The US election has happened this week. We are taking a more macro view. As we do on Rebuilders, we tend to look at big world events, but from a slightly different perspective. So, yeah, a bit of analysis of what's going on, how this kind of reveals a lot of things that we've talked about on this podcast, neoliberalism, grey zone dynamics, a whole bunch of other stuff that we'll get into during the episode. Obviously, we are talking about it from afar. We're Australians here and we don't vote in the election, but we acknowledge that there are a lot of people, a lot of listeners that are American, have voted in this election. Mark, I wonder if you have anything to say before we get into the episode.
Well, I think being in the US for almost a month recently, you really saw how people almost can't talk about this in public, and there's sort of a calm on the surface, but you don't have to scratch, too deep to see the emotions around this. And we're just aware that, this was probably a shock for a lot of people, maybe not for others. There'll be some celebrating, there'll be some sort of lamenting, others maybe not seeing a bigger deal in it. There's a range of emotions processing this. And I guess what we're trying to do, as you said, Liddy, we're not trying to give this. I looked at my news this morning, there's a million commentaries on this, but I think what we're trying to do is just offer more of a macro view on what this means in the story. You're right, the story we've been telling in this podcast. And so hopefully by doing that, maybe we can sort of offer some angles that people hadn't seen. Has this fit into the historical process? And what does this tell us about where culture's going? What does this mean for the world, not just America? We're going to be digging into some of that stuff. But also just knowing we're praying for the US. It was interesting at the 24/7 prayer gathering, I prayed for the US, and a couple of people come up to me and said, it's almost like that was almost a bit unusual, because I think there's almost this sense of like to pray for a country. And by the way, I do that, done that at other things in other countries, and it's very normal. But I think to me it spoke to how contentious things are. But, our heart is, to see God's church flourish and to see people flourish. And, that's our prayer behind all of this.
All right, well, shall we get into it?
Yeah.
Well, your first point here, Mark, as we tend to do with these episodes, is we have a few points to move through, and your first point is not a shock.
Yeah, not a shock. So we had a little in our little Rebuilders text message thread.
Yes.
I can't remember who one of you sent the text message and said, so what's going to happen or something. I think.
I'd sent it. Must have been on Tuesday, and I was like, final
thoughts before. And again, too, we're a day ahead, so we actually got to watch. It has happened while most Americans are asleep. We were watching the sort of final bits in the day, and I think I replied something like, or you predicted it, right, Liddy? So well done. I had the sense, like when you looked at this from, let's call it political science basics, Trump was going to win. When you looked at it through a lot of the commentary and, different elements that people, I guess, were putting out in different viewpoints, it was more unclear. It was quite incredible to see so much of the commentary, particularly in the sort of 24 hours, 48 hours before, just all over the shop, But if you go back to what we've been talking about on this podcast, it's a horrible time to be an incumbent leader. That everywhere, from our own Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who won a really big win in the election, beat the Conservative government and cuts in and is desperately unpopular. So the same thing in the UK. You've seen this all over the world. And anyone in power at the moment is incredibly unpopular, and there's very few governments who are staying in power. Why? Inflation. And I think there was one sort of little comment I heard. I heard Helen Thompson, who's a history professor at Cambridge, make a comment where she said, you saw Harris, get some momentum, but then it sort of started to drop off. And she said there's a really easy reason for this. I'm paraphrasing her, that in the US, food inflation went up in September.
Right.
And you hear that and you go, oh, of course. There's an element that any government where inflation comes in and goes higher, it's almost impossible to win. And, I think that is perhaps in all of the different noise and fury, and there's many things to talk about, but basically every government of any stripe, left, right, centrist, all across the world is incredibly unpopular at the moment because of core economic issues.
Yeah.
So, some people would say, point to the health of the US economy and some of the data, and this was sort of, people claim, it's the vibes recession. But the reality was a lot of the growth in the US economy has come from the Magnificent Seven, which is the tech stocks, AI, companies like this, but it's not trickling down to the average person. And coming back to the US after 5 years of not being there, it was very clear how expensive things were. And, paying for coffees and the prices you're paying for coffees in America are just astronomical in certain places. So, I think that at the end of the day is probably one of the big dynamics in the midst of this. Is it just this? No. Again, just to say, one of the silly bits of analysis that people will do at a time like this is monocausal analysis. It was down to this thing. It's never one thing, it's 70 things, So I think that's not a shock if you look at the political science basics. And I think I was explaining this to you guys the other week. I was explaining to someone that the other dynamic that you saw when you just look at this with a cold analysis of who was going to win is you saw Trump growing his base. Now, to win in an election, you never are going to win an election if you're just going for your segment or faction.
Yep.
So political parties have factions. The Australian Labor Party has a left and a right. Our Conservative Party, known here as the Liberal Party, have a left and a right. The Democrats have different constituencies, and the Democrats and the Republicans also have different constituencies. And to win, you have to go outside of your faction and you have to grow your base. So you could just see this thing where you could see the voting coming, the polling coming back in around Trump growing Latino votes, which was a huge dynamic. And he significantly grew. You could see that coming through. You saw him growing his African-American base, particularly amongst African-American men. Was he getting all African-American voters? No. Was he getting all African-American men? No. But all you need to do is shave off 5-7% and you're going to win in such a tight election. And so Trump, you could just see, if you imagine like there was two columns and one column's gaining people, you could just see over the last year Trump gaining people. That was, and maybe I'll talk about this now, one of the big themes of this election, but I'll just touch on it now so I don't forget it because I don't think I wrote this down, is what we're seeing is a shift away from the trend line of the last 10 to 15 years, which is a politics that at times was centered around identity politics, moving back to class politics. So the people that Trump was picking up in, Latinos, non-educated white women, some African-American males, different groups like that. When you then look at the economics around those people, they tend to be from the working class. So our politics for so much of the 20th century is based around class-based politics. The fact that we have a Labor Party in Australia, that was a class-based party. The Labor Party, I think Bernie Sanders came out today and said, this is what happens to the Democrats when a working class party ignores its working class base. And what you saw is that the working class went to the Republican Party. And now this is a shift. And if you want to go all the way back to you read, I was just reading Nixon Land by Daniel Perlstein. I think it was Daniel Perlstein, is that his name? Or Perlstein, whatever his name is. His last name's Perlstein, I think. This shift was happening back in 1968. And it's been this slow shift that's been happening for some time. So what you could see is that Trump was peeling off people from the Democratic base, and the Democratic base couldn't hold its coalition together. So that's just another, and you're like, who is the Democrats picking up? There was some hope that because of the Supreme Court decision around abortion, they would pick up more women. Yeah. But again, too, political science reality is that women tend to vote. When it comes to class trumps gender, in political science. So working class women are less likely to vote for an educated woman than they are for a working class male. So people tend to vote class-based that overrides. And it's the same way the other way. Like when Sarah Palin was running, who was Steve Bannon's project before Trump, you didn't have educated women in Massachusetts voting for Sarah Palin because she's a woman. So the reality is that, Trump kept getting groups and Harris wasn't gaining groups. And you could see that was, a big part of it. The other thing I think too, where it was not a shock is there is an element where, a lot of people you're seeing commentary this morning are talking about, and this morning here in Australia, talking about how is this all happening again? And in 2016, it was this unbelievable shock where pollsters got it wrong. The chattering classes, both left and right, got it wrong, and no one saw the Trump campaign coming. Now, I remember watching some, live streams and videos on YouTube, and there were people who were supporting Trump, and they would have 1 to 2 million views. You would then look at the ratings for CNN or whatever, and they'd have 300,000-400,000 people watching. And I remember thinking, this is insane. I remember one guy, I don't even remember who he was. I was trying to work out how is this movement happening? So I was getting online, trying to understand it. And I remember watching some guy, literally he was in his kitchen somewhere doing this live stream. Yeah, and he had like 2 million people watching it. And I'm like, wow, this is the death of, or the significant weakening of mainstream media.
Yeah.
Now, it's a bit of a cliche, but no one's learnt, So like you did again have so much of the sort of mainstream media. You even see that a bit here in Australia, like, in the ABC, The Age, where if you just followed that, you could not see that Trump would win. But I think what's happened is, whereas in 2016, that was almost like this sort of dissident elements of the internet and, the nether regions, and there was a lot of talk about 4chan, et cetera, et cetera. It was very marked when Trump gave his acceptance speech that he talked about people like Elon Musk, who, yes, is the richest man in the world, but also is, taking control of Twitter, or X. He talked about Joe Rogan, and I try and say this to people that someone may see, the ABC in Australia or NBC in America ran this story on this.
Yes.
The people who watch that is utterly minuscule compared to the amount of people who listen to a Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
And I think people miss, if we're so used to asking the question, what is the mainstream public thinking?
Yes.
And, they're saying this on the news. The mainstream public is more thinking like what Joe Rogan thinks and is listening to some podcast about ancient aliens. I mean, they're doing this ancient alien stuff and, all this, have these guys on is it Graham Hancock or whatever. Keanu Reeves is out doing videos with him. Do you know what I mean? Like people have mistaken how massively the public mood has shifted. So it wasn't a shock that sort of grouping in the mainstream media would get this so wrong again. So, I mean, this win, and I think I haven't looked at the latest updates at the time of recording, but, he won the electoral vote quite easily. He could win the popular vote, which no one was predicting that. They could possibly win the House and the Senate. This is a clean sweep. And the fact that no one saw that, or in the sort of commentary class, even in the UK, had Rory Stewart predict on The Rest of Politics, which is one of the most popular podcasts in the United Kingdom, that it was going to be a Harris landslide, and I saw that tweet and I was like, wow, there's a guy in politics, ran for the leader of the Conservative Party, runs a politics podcast. And he just goes, how did they get it so wrong? So I think that this is not, is it a shock that the mainstream media got it wrong after all we've seen in the last 8 years? Back to Brexit? No. Is it a shock that an incumbent government lost with high inflation? No. But I think probably what is a shock is to see the tone of a campaign and some of the things spoken about by the Trump campaign, particularly around, mass deportation and these sort of issues. There's a political language there, which I think is shocking to people, and that it's to some people, and that someone who had a platform like that would get in is a tremendous shock to many people. So I think that's probably the shock. So from a political science basics, it's not a shock, but I think a lot of people would find themselves in the US and around the world in shock, or a percentage of people, because of those dimensions of it.
Sure. Okay, well, shall we leap into the next point?
Yeah.
So what it feels like when your political health declines.
Yeah. So when I was in the US, I got asked this a lot one-on-one, and I got asked this a lot I think I got asked this publicly when I did some Q&As. How do I see things going? Oh, can I just go back one second? I'm just going to say one other point I forgot to say with not a shock. The other thing I'm going to come clean. When I was in the US, occasionally you realize that if you're in an Uber or you're in a cafe and people can't hear you and you're talking to someone, and you just end up chatting to people in cafes, random people, Uber drivers, taxi drivers. They say stuff to you because they think you're an Australian and you're outside of the system that you realize they're not going to tell their friends and family.
Yeah.
And so I do play a little bit the naive Aussie sometimes, just as for research, more just like, hey, what's going on with your election? What's going to happen? Geez, mate, what's going on? It's a bit crazy. What do you reckon's happening? And it's fascinating how honest they'll be. And I did this a bit on my last trip and had multiple people say to me, I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I'm going to probably vote for Trump. And some have said it, and others you could just sense you haven't told anyone this. So I think that was the other thing. The shy Trump vote does not get picked up by polling. Polling is so off because there's a lot of people who, if a poll still rings, they tell them they're going to vote for the other side, but they're voting Trump. So that was just a point from the last section. But going back to this question, what I was trying to help people understand is one of the things that polarization does is it doesn't enable you to see the overarching picture. Yeah. And I think that the thing that I would say that is what has happened in the US and why it feels so fractious, why it feels unnerving to people is, around the world, there is a political scale where you look at the health of institutions. You look at the political health of a country, and political scientists literally have measuring bars on this, And at the top, you might have a Denmark, but at the bottom, you might have a country like Haiti. And it's that the health of democratic institutions, how much people have trust in government, political accountability, transparency, corruption, all of these things. Part of the story of what's happened in the last 10 years is you have seen a decline, and this goes back through multiple – you could go right back to the assassination of John F. Kennedy if you wanted to. Yeah. But 1968, you go right back to Vietnam War, civil rights movement. You go right back. But particularly, I'd say in the last sort of 10 years, you've seen a significant decline in the political health of the US. So the Democratic Health Index has gone down. And so, how I look at it is I look at the totality. And one of the dominant things that you have to come away with is what I noticed in America too is that when I spoke to many people, whether they're voting for Harris, not going to voting for Trump, almost everyone didn't like both candidates. Like no one was like, oh, Harris is the absolute best thing since sliced cheese or Trump's the best thing since sliced cheese. They were like, I don't really like this about them, but I'm going to vote. And this concept of the double haters where it's like so many people don't like the two candidates, so many people are saying, is this the best two we can come up with? That is a dynamic of a degrading or declining political health in a society. That's the big picture. And so you saw things like, you saw at the Donald Trump rally, Hulk Hogan coming out and ripping his shirt, but then also you saw at Harris campaigns, twerking and there was an element where to the rest of the world, this did seem like some weird Vegas show, and that's not, I'm not saying that as having a cheap shot from afar. It felt like to the rest of the world that there was a decline in the level of the political. Now people can go back and lament the time of Obama and George W. Bush and feel it, but also some of I think the right begins back there in the sense of economic decisions that led to the global financial crisis, wars in the Middle East and overreach and the Iraq War. These are the things which really shook the foundations. You can go back to even September 11th, the war on terror, surveillance state. You can go back to a lot of this is where the rot sort of set in some of those ways. And again, too, I don't want to be like some dramatic the rot. I'm more saying if you see a decline in political health, it has been happening for some time, and what you're seeing is an acceleration. The other just dynamic is you see this ongoing dynamic, not just in the US, but you see this throughout the world, is that often what you'll have a swing to the authoritarian right after you've seen an overreach on the progressive or liberal left. Yeah. This is just a pattern that goes on. You saw this in the 60s when Nixon was elected. You see these elements where there is a sort of cyclical nature to this. I think that's also a dynamic that has happened. The other thing that you're seeing too is that, we've talked about this stat, I've quoted multiple times here, that since the pandemic, when there was an economic shock, Oxfam's study shows that the sort of 1% or the 1% of the 1% have become incredibly rich since 2020, and that the economic inequality all around the world, but in the United States, has significantly sharpened.
Yeah.
And you see this. This has always been true in the US, but you just notice that you'll be in certain parts. You can walk around New York and you're certain parts, and it feels like things aren't as good as they were when I was last there in 2019. But then you go up around the park and you're on these wealthier neighborhoods, and it feels wonderful. You can be in parts of Portland downtown, which, wow, this has been really affected. But then you're in nicer neighborhoods and it feels great. So there is this increasing gap between people when it comes to how they experience their life, but also economically as well. And that's always going to be politically volatile whenever there is that inequality. And countries that become more destabilized is when that gap grows. The last thing I'd say is that you have to also name a dynamic that is happening in the world, and maybe we'll pull out as we go through these things like, we talked about neoliberalism, we talked about the social contract, that people were willing to work hard if they felt that that was going to benefit them personally.
Yeah.
Around the world, we're seeing a decline, particularly in emerging generations, around the belief in democracy. And many people, and this is hard medicine to take if you like democracy, which I still think is the best of a bad bunch, the fact that democracy is on the decline in terms of people's estimation around the world. This is also true in the US. There was this fascinating exit poll that came out of just before the election, as people were voting, which was the number one reason that I think it was 34% of Americans were voting for the health of democracy. And a lot of the pundits were like, this is good news for Harris. Later in the night, I saw some data, I can't remember who put it up, that the majority of those people, to the +7, who were concerned about the health of democracy, voted Trump. What does that say to you? It says that you have a large part of the country who are concerned about the health of democracy. One half sees the threat to democracy as they'd call it the woke left. The other half would see it as the authoritarian right.
Sure.
So overarching, this is a kind of crisis in democracy where both sides see that the other group is totalitarian, overreaching, is going to dominate them, force them into submission, not to live their lives like they want. And you got two sides both pointing. It's that Spider-Man meme where everyone's pointing at everyone. So this is ultimately a breakdown of the political process. So the way for Healing to America is that takes time. And I'm actually thinking in our future episodes, I'd love to do a whole episode on this, but trust is something that you don't, it's like an umpire referee in sport. When it's working well, you don't even think about it. But when trust erodes, you're in trouble. So I think part of the process of political deterioration is when there's little trust, and there's little trust in the American political system, but that's also flowing down, I think, into much of the rest of life as well. So overarchingly, this is not an issue of polarization. This is a national issue for the United States going forward. And, I go back, you had Trump, question the results in 2020, and you had January the 6th, and we did an episode on that. But also too, you had the Democrats when Trump won questioning, there's highlight reels of just goes for 20 minutes of Democrats questioning Trump's win. So you're at a point now, and Harris has just done a concession speech. We haven't watched all of that. There's an element where politics works well when, you sort of accept the loss. There's a safe transition of power, but both sides have got to sort of work at that. And the rebuilding of trust in the political system, in institutions, in cultural and social life is going to be absolutely fundamental to the US going forward.
Well, the next point is the shift from idealism to realism, which is a thing that we've talked about a number of times on this podcast.
Yeah. This is another big shift that we're saying is happening in the world. So again, you go back, tell the story. We often tell it in, and I'll tell it in a slightly different way in Rebuilders, is you got to go back to 1989, fall of the communist world. You have a unipolar moment in the world. The US is the dominant power in the world, but it's also a liberal democratic power. So all of a sudden, it's not competing against communism. It's the only show in town. The US military has pretty much full spectrum dominance, which is their military doctrine.
Yes.
They control the trade routes of the world. And what they do is they instigate a world order of globalization, free trade, but also that they are then like, well, let's export our liberalism to the world. And I'm talking about liberalism in the broader sense here. Liberalism, we see George W. Bush export to the Middle East in the hope that the Middle East can become liberal democracies, and the invasion of Iraq and the removing of Saddam Hussein was a hope that, that Iraq would become a functioning, pluralistic, multicultural democracy, liberal democracy. That hasn't happened. And, there were the neoconservatives who were sort of radical, the people around the Bush White House and the Project for a New American Century. And these were the people who believed that democracy could be exported around the world. This was the belief that Iraqis would greet them with flowers when the tanks rolled into Baghdad, and it didn't happen. But what you saw that continue. So you saw that the liberal project was dominant, and that was true. That was then this overreach you saw happen at a geopolitical level, but you also saw it at a domestic level. So you saw certain things like the US Supreme Court decision on gay marriage, and then people going, oh, that's happened, so therefore people are going to want to go with the entire sort of suite of things, and transgender education, school, all this. They're going to go, this is now the moment where liberalism has won. And again, too, it simply wasn't that way, know. And so that's very much like, we want to build the world that we dream it could be versus dealing with the world as it is, which is realism. So you saw this liberal overreach both internationally and domestically without competitors, but there was actually a pushback. So interestingly, you're now seeing a much more realistic thing in the world. Now, again, too, like watching multiple videos of people being interviewed on streets is really interesting. I watched a number of YouTube videos like this where they would interview someone and they would say, why are you voting for Trump? And they would say, the economy. And then they would say, what do you think about him as a person? I actually don't like him as a person. Or they might say someone who is, from a different minority group who's spoken against. What do you think about that? Well, he did say some stuff I don't agree. But I saw one interview with a Puerto Rican American young woman, and they said, "What about the Puerto Rican comment?" She goes, "I was offended, but basically I got a stimulus check, or I got more money, or whatever."
Sure.
So people will vote far more transactionally than people who are in politics realize.
Yeah.
A lot of people get into politics for liberal idealistic reasons on both sides, but they don't realize that so much of the average voter is very transactional and realist in their voting. So, for example, realism in international politics is like, you're North Korea, we don't like you, we're completely against everything you do, but we'll have some peace talks with you because we don't want you to fire missiles. So we'll swallow our idealism because we've got to deal with you in the real world. That's actually how a lot of people vote. And so if you go back to I think we're in an idealistic period. Millennials lived in an idealistic period. Obama, I've talked about it before, it was a classic embodiment of that. Yes, we can, highly idealistic. Again, too, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just stating the change that's happening. We're moving back to a much more transactional, realist world. And I think what so many people missed is that's how so many people vote now.
Yeah. And we have talked about this before as well, that's kind of emerged off the back of COVID.
Yes.
Financial things across financial
yes,
things.
Financial. Yeah, the inflation.
Crises across the world. Yeah.
And I think we said that before, like when the economy is going really well, people are happy. There's money in the bank. They can take a holiday overseas. They can go to a restaurant. They will let the idealistic liberal side do more. because in a sense they're like, whatever, I'm happy in my little world here. All of a sudden, when you go from the highly idealistic issues of some sort of topic, but then the economy starts to fall out and inflation's there. It goes from the highly idealistic topic of should we do this down to my bread is twice the price. I saw. I mean, like butter. I think you and I have had like butter's like $9. For the tub. Like it used to be $3. When that stuff starts to happen, people's tolerance of idealism starts to wane very quickly, and it becomes much more me, the people around me, getting on and doing what they're able to do. So that's been the big change. And again, going back to earlier Rebuilders episodes. I go back to the Jack Dorsey tweet, who's the former owner of Twitter, just tweeted, inflation's coming. This was, I don't know, just before inflation hit. Something like inflation's coming and it's going to change the world. Today's further evidence of that.
Yeah.
Just quickly, is that just to simplify what you're just saying? Is that a little bit of Maslow's hierarchy?
Yes.
Kind of where we hit the top and now we're coming back down kind of thing?
Yes, totally. Yeah, we are coming down and, I think I've spoken here, Engelhardt has a scale as well.
Yeah.
We're much more into issues of scarcity and security.
Yeah.
And countries that are much more in scarcity and security see issues very differently than a country where everything's provided for.
Yes.
It's a big shift that's going on politically, and I don't think the Dems got that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Well, I wonder if we move into the next one. It's a grey zone election.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other big sort of analytical belief that we've spoken about at Rebuilders, I've written about this in Anonymous Presence, is we're in this grey zone between that period that I spoke about, the era 1989 to maybe, you could say 2008, the global financial crisis probably didn't really wear off till maybe 2014, 2015, where economy was doing fairly well, unipolar moment in the world, neoliberalism was the dominant vision of the world. You had a highly unregulated economy. It was almost the dream of the most right-wing economists, but then sort of socially liberal as well. It was this really interesting time. And, that political era is over, is what this is saying. And we went into this grey zone, and I think sort of since 2015, you can feel the new order beginning to be birthed. And I think that this is almost solidifying it now. Like the old order where you could throw up a Mitt Romney, a sort of John McCain, or even a Hillary Clinton, that order's done. Like it's gone. And you're seeing that not just in the world, you're seeing, and there was one really interesting thing I saw last week, which just made me quite convinced that I thought Trump would win. And actually it was from Canada. So Trudeau, who would exemplify that idealistic liberal sort of politics, and we've seen how unpopular he's become, which has been a sign of the change, and it's sort of similarly to Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, sort of emblematic of that movement, or the later part of that movement. He came out, and after COVID, Canada went big on, we're going to do immigration, we're going to stimulate the economy by doing immigration. Australia is doing something very similar. A lot of countries are doing something similar. And basically, and apologies to Canadians if I don't get all of the details right, but effectively came out and almost reversed course. He almost said, we're going to pull back immigration for 2 years, cut back students, and it was quite like an un-Trudeau-like message. And I just saw someone respond on a tweet to that video and said, he's seen some numbers. So very true. He would have seen some internal polling that he is gone and his party are going to be utterly wiped out if they keep the path they're going on, which was the old path, that there is a massive swing going on in the world. And when I saw that, I thought, if Trudeau is having to change his political sort of doctrine here, there is big change happening in the world. So another change I saw was the Democratic, if you think about Night of the Proms in the Royal Albert Hall is this iconic British event, every year where it's very nationalistic, and they would sing, Royal Britannia and all these songs and have these opera singers, and they'd all wave Union Jacks. But there was sort of this stage where a few years ago, it became this thing where literally, particularly after Brexit, you could sort of wave every flag bar a Union Jack. And there was rainbow flags and Scottish flags and European Union flags. And it was just this sea of almost like, there was obviously, you could wave a Union Jack if you had one of those flags alongside of it. And it was almost like this sort of like anti-nationalist moment in reaction to what seemed to be rising nationalism. What was incredibly telling was at the DNC, a sea of American flags. The Democrats had the American flags out. Kamala was talking about how she owns a gun. And again, going back to Gary Gerstl's theory of political orders, when the political order shifts is when the opposition starts to mimic the new order.
Yeah.
Again, going back, a lot of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act policies was simply Trump's America First policies rebadged. Tariffs, supporting manufacturing, onshoring. So we are moving away from globalization as it's been understood in the last period. And what we're doing is that you're going to see the Democrats go through a period, probably the harder left will split off and keep pressing in. But there's going to be people in the party going, this direction we're going is losing us elections. And so what Trump's trying to do is a gray zone strategy. Okay, so it's actually fascinatingly confusing. So on one hand, he's getting someone like a Musk in who's like, we're going to cut regulations. I was listening to an interview this morning on the BBC financial show with one of his economic advisors who's like, Trump's going to cut taxes. That's very neoliberal. Cut taxes, cut regulations, allow the market to do its thing. So it's a hybrid what he's doing. Half neoliberalism. And so that's why a lot of the neoliberals and like the stock markets, I mean, Daniel's stock market tracker is just booming. It's added something like 2.6, he's smiling there, $2.6 trillion or something like that. You can quote me.
No, I just like that you've put me as a junkie, stock market junkie.
Yeah, are you a stock market junkie? No. It's not really. So I'm more meant that you're aware of what's going on.
Yes.
You're not like checking your stocks every 5 minutes.
I
but
wish.
You and I often will talk about what's happening. But It's actually, so there's an element that parts of the market were actually really happy with some of the Trump policies coming in. And a lot of wealthy people around the world are really concerned that left-wing governments coming in, like particularly Labor in Britain, the amount of millionaires who are considering leaving Britain because of a wealth tax almost seems inevitable because government coffers are empty. So there's a part of the market that's really happy with the neoliberal side of Trump's policies. But then what he's also doing is a lot of people forget that Trump went to the left of Clinton on some actual policies around welfare and healthcare. So Trump also has realized that he's trying to capture the working class, former Democratic voters, so who want benefits, who want healthcare, and they want tariffs to protect them from globalization. And the Rust Belt states, which he picked up in this swing, they want protection from their jobs going to China or Mexico or whatever. So he's actually doing this like massive tariff promises. So it's a weird hybrid model that he's doing of half neoliberalism, half old school left-wing trade policies that like the Australian Labor Party would have done in 1962.
Yeah.
So it's going to be really interesting how that hybrid survives. Is it the new political order? Will he pull it off? Or is it going to be not work? So it's like people are trying to like grab for images of, like what could be. And look, to be honest, and this is where I'm going to give a little bit of my, I guess my analysis of it. I wondered if Niall Ferguson wrote an article, other people have written an article, are we the Soviets now? Has the US hit a sort of kind of late Soviet stagnation where the Soviets had, a number of, Brezhnev and Andropov or whatever, and Chernenko or whatever, that hopefully I'm getting the names right, the last Soviet leaders before Mikhail Gorbachev. And the country was in stagnation. Brezhnev was trying to lead the Soviet Union. The guy was looked like he was half asleep. He was so old and drunk and stuff like this. And there's a sense with Biden, being in a very similar thing, that it just felt like, is this some kind of stagnation? And then does Trump represent, his vision is very much like, there's these memes online of 80s America, early 90s America. It's a reaching back. Harris is trying to do some sort of Democratic coalition of, like sort of the past, or, like a sort of Clinton redux or Obama redux. Is there actually the move to a new political order happening in the US, or is that going to happen somewhere else in the world? And America's now stagnating. So it's going to be really interesting. All this is going to play out, in time. And I think also I'll just end there.
Okay, well, I wonder if it's worth exploring. I mean, you've just sort of mentioned implications across the world, but what are the global implications of, Trump now being president?
Well, I mean, a lot of people listening are also not from the US. We said acknowledge those who are. And there's people who listen to this podcast from all over the world, us here in Australia, but Europe, all over the place. This, I think, will mark the shift from a unipolar moment to a multipolar moment. Trump's foreign policy is definitely predicated on less overseas involvement militarily. It's based on an America first economic policy. So that global vision of the US as the world's policeman, of America dominating global trade, or trying to create this free trade bloc that it benefits from, being at the head of these global initiatives like the IMF and the World Bank, that's going to be pulled back. NATO going to be pulled back. And instead you're going to see a world where, yes, the US is still probably the dominant power, but you've got competitors, China, this axis of Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, other nations, Turkey, India, which has sort of always been part of the non-aligned movement. It's not going to be one power that dominates. There's going to be lots of powers. America's still going to be the big boy in the room, but there's going to be lots of other powers as well. Clearly, I think you're going to see a shift on Ukraine. And I think you're going to see less funding of Ukraine, which really became increasingly politically problematic. When you've got people living in Rust Belt states who see their infrastructure, jobs going, factories closing, and then you're seeing on the news that how many $1 billion have gone to Ukraine.
Sure.
Even the rightness of that fight, whatever you think of that, that's still going to be always politically difficult. Trump understood that, and I think he'll pull back from Ukraine, which is going to have huge implications for for Europe. So Europe has relied on the American sort of, let's call it the defense umbrella, where America has carried the significant share of security for Europe, and provided the most money and other things for Europeans. There's a number of European countries who are not paying their sort of 2% NATO expectation. And the one thing I noticed, it was interesting watching the US election when it would have been like somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. in America. Got onto Twitter and there was hardly any Americans there. I think many had gone to bed, but it was filled with European leaders all tweeting essentially the same thing. It's now time for Europe to take control of its own defense. So you're going to see military growth in Europe, and this is going to be hugely politically disruptive for Europe. Look at Britain, look at Germany, look at France, look at these countries. There are significant economic issues, and I'm just talking about the big ones. You've seen a swing to the right across Europe. I think this will continue because Europe is already struggling to pay for its welfare, struggling to pay for numerous things. It's going to have to pay more for defense, and that's going to have to be taken from somewhere when they don't have much money. So it's going to significantly change Europe. Will you see countries like Poland being more assertive, France being more assertive? This is going to have shocks for Germany, particularly as tariffs go on some stuff for Europe. So Europe, the EU, whether it likes it or not, is going to find itself in a trade war with the US. So it's in a trade war with China. It's going to find itself in a trade war with US. And so you're seeing this shift from Ukraine to China is what you're going to see in Trump's policy. Trump is like, I'm not going to be involved in wars, but Trump clearly has an adversarial relationship with China. And way back in Trump's early sort of political days, when he's dipping his toe back in the 80s, he was very big on Japan taking jobs and Japan beating America. As that shifted from Japan to China, this is what's marked, the trade war he's begun. So we're going to see a significant trade war and increased, I think, tensions between China and the US. And that's going to really change our region as well. So we're going to move from sort of globalization to America first. One last point on this as well. Huge news yesterday, which got overshadowed by the US election, was that Netanyahu sacked his military chiefs, particularly Yoav Gallant. Many people have seen those military chiefs as quite aggressive in the military strategy that pursued, but even still holding Netanyahu back somewhat in his strategy. With Trump coming in, I think Netanyahu is going to have more of a free hand. So I think you're going to see this will change the dynamic of the Middle East. Also, as I've talked about, I think in one of our previous episodes, the Democratic Party has tended to slightly prefer Iran to the sort of Gulf states, Saudis. Trump is much more aligned to Israel and Saudi and much more anti-Iran. So Iran at this point will find itself even more sort of ostracized. So I think you're going to see a changing dynamic in the Middle East, and I think perhaps more chaos and perhaps, like Iran is promising another attack in the next hours and stuff against Israel. We'll see how that goes. But I think that sort of Trump's promise that, hey, I'm going to stop all these things. I think he promised to stop the Ukraine war in his first 24 hours or something like this, and do a deal. Okay, that's really hard when Russia has in its constitution now included provinces or oblasts of Ukraine as parts of Russian territory that it doesn't yet fully control militarily.
Right. This
is going to be one of the most intense deals. Also, we've talked about Ukraine has gone into the Kursk region. So Russia's not going to want to give that up. The pulling off of that deal that Trump's sort of crowing that he can do, I just don't see how it can happen.
Well, this brings us to our final point.
Yeah.
Which feels somewhat ominous.
Yes.
The coming crisis.
Yeah. Look, I think I've quoted John Gray, the philosopher, who made a point that, this is a couple of years ago, someone asked him, what happens in the future with the Conservative. I think I talk about the last UK election, looking forward to it by a year or two. And he said the crisis will come not at the election. The crisis will come when Labor gets into power in the UK and people realise they can't do anything. And to be honest, I do feel in a year or two's time, I feel that there'll be a similar crisis in the US. Both the promises of Harris and Trump were predicated on significant tax cuts and Trump's thing, different spending in terms of Harris. America does not have the money to do this. America is unbelievably in debt. And those debt payments are only going to increase. And I do think that this hybrid economic model that Trump's going to do is going to be really hard to pull off. So whilst I think we're seeing this initial sugar hit in the market, and that may continue. Will that translate from Wall Street to Main Street is a big question I have. The other thing I would say is that, whoever was going to win this election, and it was a big win. If he gets the Electoral College, the popular vote, and the two houses, it was a big win. But don't forget, some of the people in Rust Belt states that voted him in 2016 voted him out in 2020 when they weren't happy with his performance and have voted him back in. They're not as rusted onto Trump as you think. So there's a lot of people like he got in because they want him to deliver something. If he doesn't deliver this, it's going to go in the other direction. Plus, you've also got a significant part of the country who is just very unhappy at this result. So the polarization has not gone away. It's still there. And there's a number of these interesting coalitions that Trump managed to pull off to get this election almost unthinkable. So for example, he significantly increased his vote amongst American Muslims, which is incredible. When you go back to his Muslim ban, and I remember there were protesters at American airports over this, the fact that in certain places he would get such a high percentage of Muslims because of Gaza, really, and the Democratic Party is continuing to fund Israel. He saw this backlash and they thought, we don't like him, but hopefully he'll bring peace. And at the same time, he got an increase in the Muslim vote. He also got an increase in the Orthodox Jewish vote. So they saw the same candidate as being very pro-Israel. So a lot of Jews saw him as the most pro-Israel, whilst a lot of Muslim Americans and Arab Americans saw him as not as sort of, better for Palestine, which is fascinating. That cannot last.
Yeah.
You're pointing your hopes over someone. Once that gets into practical policy, he's going to go in either direction. Now, maybe he manages to pull it off. I don't know how you pull it off. I'm just going to say that. So I think that there's a number of these little coalition things he pulled off that you're not going to be able to deliver. And as I said before, another thing is Trump is about to inherit the incumbency trap.
Yeah.
So just as Keir Starmer is experiencing, just as Anthony Albanese is experiencing here, just as Chancellor Scholz is experiencing in Germany, it's going to be really, really hard once you're in power. The power position, if you like, is now not being in power. Visibility is the new fragility. When you're in power, you now have to make this stuff happen. And I think our ability to spin our way out of things is decreasing rapidly. So I think what you're going to see is the social contract has turned to Trump and said, we don't want what the other crew are doing. We're going to hand it to you, but you need to deliver. So all of those things I think are coming together that sadly, I hate to say from an analytical point of view, that the stability is I don't see in the future. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that there's flourishing and peace. But I just think that the underlying structural issues that have brought the sort of tumult of the last few years are still there, and if not more acute, particularly on the sort of fiscal side with debt and so on.
Sure.
So that's a bracing summary. But I just do wonder if in the midst of this, there is an element where people will begin to see that perhaps politics doesn't have all the answers. I think there is a limit to politics and what it can achieve in the world. I think politics can do some things, but it can't do all things. And I do just wonder whether one thing is, like one rays of hope is when, read American history, there was an element where after the political sort of, polarization in the 60s and, into the 70s, some of the sort of tumult economically in the 70s, you began to see that people got tired of it. And I do wonder whether I just, sense that will be an exhaustion. And perhaps at that point, people will begin to, look to beyond politics, perhaps to the local as well. And, there's always, the classic mantra we often repeat on here is that crisis precedes renewal. And I just wonder too if there's elements of the church which will start to see that the answer isn't necessarily in politics. Yes, it's engagement in politics, but there's an element here that there's only certain things that God can do that politics cannot. And so I do wonder in the midst of this, perhaps one of these sort of outplaying of this, and it doesn't feel like this at this time, but if what I just outlaid does indeed happen, whether the sort of siren's call of politics ideologically that can begin to sound like a hymn begins to recognize for the siren's call of ideology versus theology. And we begin to start to look to God, or people start to look to God for what only God can do. And always at moments like this, the church has moments of renewal and renaissance, always at moments like this. I know we've repeated that many, many times, but I think for many people listening today, it's worth hearing that again. We've told this narrative of what's happening in the world, but the narrative we continually speak on this podcast is that at moments like this, that actually hope is born. Good, beautiful things grow out of the compost. So in the midst of all of this, I think the discipline will be seeing the potentials, and prayer to God births new potentials at moments like this.
Amen. Well, thank you for that, Mark. That's a really helpful overview of everything that's happening, not just in the US, but across the world. If you are listening and you want a list of the resources or books and articles that Mark mentioned during the episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and subscribing there. We send out an email to subscribers a couple of days after our episode airs. Thank you again for joining us. And let's continue to pray for our world.
Amen.